Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here for the first Land Terre Design Research Network event. Before I say much about what we're trying to do with Land Terre Design Research, I'd like to just say that the whole impetus for this starting actually happened at a CSLA meeting in Mexico City, which to me that's a bit weird to have a CSLA meeting in Mexico City. But I met Heather Braden, and Heather came charging up and said, you guys are from U of M, you haven't sent me your curriculum yet. And I said, yeah, I'm not going to, because we work hard at building curriculum. Why should we just send it to some school that wants to start out in down housing? You know, I mean, what else do you want from me? My shirt? I don't even know you. And Heather went, I never even thought of that before. And I was like, well, you know, maybe you should, because you realize yourself now how difficult it is to actually build curriculum. And so I think being quite upfront with her started a relationship that just hasn't stopped. And we then went on to talking about what a shame it was that there were really no events in Canada where academics got together to talk about what we're doing. And so we vowed then that we were going to do something about this, and it then moved on to the World Design Forum in Montreal, which again I think it's CSLA Mexico City World Design Forum. So we asked people from across the country in every school if they wanted to get together for a presentation of just work that we're doing that's related to research. Heather did not set out to ask all women from these schools, but the responses that she got were all from women. And we then, when we met in Montreal and did this presentation, I mean, it is quite striking that it's all women. And we discussed at lunch that we really should try to get something going here, research network. And we had applied for an LACF grant, which we got, which acted as seed money to get an SSHRC grant. And all of the partner schools contributed. I was the principal investigator, but I actually believe that it has something to do with the fact that it was all women. And no offense to my male colleagues, but there should have been a design research network in Canada before now, and perhaps it's due to the fact that it's women who actually just try to get the work done to do it. So that's my annoyed Donald Trump spiel of the day. Maybe not the last, but the start. So, questions, methods, partnerships, research crossover. In Canada, there are 7 recognized schools of landscape architecture. Today, actually, this is wrong, that was yesterday. Yesterday, the core team addressed diversity in research, collaborative approaches, and potentials in our individual faculties, and how to mobilize landscape-based interdisciplinary research. From the regional or institution level, the discussion, we hope, would expand to the national level to identify, address, and provide further insights into current Canadian landscape research. Each school brought at least one student to the event, and our hope is that those students feel empowered to actually join in on discussions, to summarize, which they will at the end of the day on today's event. But it's equally as important that students are part of this conversation in this network as academics are. But obviously having schools across the country, it's a big country, issues are different, regions are different. What are the ways that we're approaching research? What are the ways that research is impacting our educational programs? And what impact are we having on a national level? So today we have researchers, scholars from each school. We have expert guests from related disciplines, students and the public. But we'll talk a little bit more about this later. We're focusing on three areas just for this event: Indigenous matters, heritage and identity, and climate change. Obviously, there are so many more issues in landscape research, but to try to focus the event, we're concentrating on these three. Okay, so what we really want to do is, in the long term, is to set up a website presence that people will link their research to. Obviously, to have more events like this to talk about Canadian research, find ways that we can actually start impacting decisions that are made in the land, in our cities, in our agricultural areas, rural, bush, resource management, the north, all of these areas. But I do think that we need to start concentrating on getting out to each other and to the rest of the world, work that is being done to let people know that we exist here in Canada, but also to find what gaps are there. What are we not doing? Why are we not being as successful in getting the word of what landscape architecture can do across? Or maybe we are. So that's generally what this whole thing is about. As I look at my partners, did I miss anything? Yeah? Heather especially wanted me to say that it was 7 women. As I look at them, let's see, what time is it? No. Okay. I think I'm ahead of schedule now. I am. Alan's not here. Alan Tate isn't here. Does anyone have any questions about the research network? Students want to add anything to this after our day yesterday? No. Okay. We're going to be way ahead of schedule.
More discussion.
More discussion time. It's funny because I had a much longer introduction to this topic, but we decided last night, because we were so late in moving yesterday, that we should just shorten everything. So I was like, we're going to be finished by noon. Okay, so the first core area that we're looking at is Indigenous matters. From the application, the SSHRC application, our landscape is in a constant state of change, from the physical forces acting upon it to the cultural values imposed on it. The natural and the built landscape is malleable. One continuum, often overlooked in colonial landscape histories, is Indigenous knowledge. This session will address past disparities by inviting elders and policymakers into a discussion about Indigenous knowledge and landscape architecture. The professional guidelines outlined in the Canadian Landscape Charter and recommendations proposed by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission form the foundation of this research focus to highlight the diversity of our regional landscapes while developing shared values and professional approaches to a shared landscape vision. The Charter's vision is inclusive and strongly aligned with many of the values among Canada's Indigenous cultures. While landscapes vary physiographically across the country, like cultural nuances, they're fundamentally driven by a local understanding and a knowledge of place. Indigenous knowledge is an invaluable primary source in landscape research. The pathway to reconciling incongruencies is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country. Research in landscape architecture is typically built around contested lands, along with economic, cultural, spiritual, and recreational uses. In this session, research transects the reconciliation process by asking questions. Rather than looking for answers, the aim is to open pathways for research and foster collaborative initiatives within the discipline and find potential avenues to build upon existing research in art, literature, history, and law. This is what we wrote in our application. I'd say issues within research in landscape architecture, period, have to do with many, actually many things that we talked about yesterday. Yesterday, the students and the core group met to talk through all of these issues, and in relation to Indigenous matters, inevitably we're caught in a real bind because, as was said yesterday, here we are, a group of white settlers with no Indigenous voices in the group. And how do we try to encourage more Indigenous students to come into landscape architecture? How do we create links and conversations, and how do we even start from that point? And so I'm very cognizant of the fact that in this description to SSHRC, we wrote that we would be inviting elders. And there are no elders here. And I think that this, again, it highlights a problem that we have. At the University of Manitoba, we have many initiatives in relation to encouraging research in and around Indigenous issues. The Department of Native Studies is a very strong unit within the university. We have a very big resource right across the way in the Indigenous Center, but the whole university is looking to this small group of people on campus saying, can you come, can you talk to, and I mean, quite frankly, well, I've heard this over and over, they're all just getting quite tapped out because there are only so many hours in the day. And so I would urge all of you to think about this and how you can build relationships with people outside of your initial group. As an educator here in the faculty, I've been working very hard to try to encourage students to think more about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I've also been trying to encourage students to think more about who actually has lived on any land that we're looking at, who lives there now. When you look at culture and history, whose culture and whose histories. And I'm very happy to say that a lot of our students are moving towards doing work in relation to Indigenous matters that I think is quite meaningful, and I hope that in their careers they'll see a big change from where things are right now. One of my favorite quotes that I use and abuse too much, but in the end we will conserve only what we love, we will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we're taught. And so I think that we all have an obligation to engage in the Truth and Reconciliation process. But more than that, we have a real obligation to try to educate our students to be cognizant of what Canada is and who is part of Canada. So, having said that, I'm now going to pass this mic over to Jim Thomas. I know that it says, whoops, I know it says that Sherry's speaking before Jim, but Sherry and Jim started emailing each other, and they changed the order of the day without telling us, so. Jim Thomas, if you don't know, is, if I say you're a partner at HTFC, a senior advisor at HTFC. Jim has done a lot of work in Indigenous communities in Manitoba, in Ontario, that's it?
No, various places.
Various places across the country. So I introduced Jim to you. Come on, Jim.
Okay, cooking with gas. All right, well, good morning, everybody. And you may be excited to hear that because we're running early, that gave me a little relief because if any of you have listened to me before, you know that I have a bad habit of possibly having too many slides. So I strategically went in front of Sherry in order to make sure that I would get the bulk of the time. No, actually, that's not true. We discussed and decided that a good way to split up what we're going to talk about is I'm going to talk a little bit about principles and some general topics, and then Sherry's going to talk a little bit more about her experience in projects and working with people, which works fine because I couldn't decide which one I wanted to do. And so I also have a break point in the slides, so if I'm using up too much time, I can stop and we can move on. So what really is interesting about when you're asked to do these kinds of discussions is it forces you to think and try to explain some of your thinking about the work you do. And as was explained, I'm a senior advisor with HTFC Planning and Design here in Winnipeg. That means perhaps one day I might be accepted and thought of as an elder, but it's been about 40 years almost of practice in the same place, and it seems like it was almost yesterday. And as a result of that, I have a few things that I thought I'd like to talk to you. But first, a little bit about myself. I was born in the place called Toronto, from immigrants from the United Kingdom, from England. And I lived in Southern Ontario for about 20 years, a little bit more than 20 years. And then I moved here to the west, to Manitoba, into the homeland of the Métis and Treaty 1 territory. And I've lived here since then. And it's interesting is the more that I've done my work, certainly in recent years, I realize I'm just repeating a pattern that's occurred annually since about 1870 with the flood of people from Upper Canada, followed by Europeans and then other nations from around the world. So I'm a settler and a colonizer, and I am happy to be here and today to talk to you from that perspective. Much of my professional practice, going back 40 years, from even before working with HTFC, has been working with and for Indigenous people and communities. And as Marcy said, it was primarily of late here in Manitoba and Ontario, but before that I also worked with Métis and Inuit people in the Northwest Territories and in parts of Alberta and Northwestern Ontario, and we've taken work across the country, but it's primarily in this stomping ground, and most of the work I've done with First Nations people. I'm also a member of the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects Task Force on Indigenous Issues, and you may not have heard about that or may not be aware of that task force, but it was, I'm going to talk briefly about it, and my presentation today is based on those three experiences. So that the Indigenous Issues Task Force, the Task Force on Indigenous Issues, was formed by the Board of Directors, or established by the Board of Directors of CSLA in November of 2016, with a mandate to guide the CSLA in improving awareness and capacity supporting Canada's First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples through landscape architecture and land use planning within our leadership, membership, and schools of landscape architecture. The committee is quite small, and the ones who are active in it are perhaps 4. But we hope to be expanding our membership in the months ahead. Since it was established, we prepared a discussion document, which is on the CSLA website, available for you to download and read, we undertook some preliminary research, an environmental scan with the assistance of about 20 CSLA volunteers, and we looked at activities by landscape architects and within the profession of landscape architecture and allied professions with respect to Indigenous matters, and have prepared a draft environmental scan document. We've also conducted a workshop at last Congress to share ideas and provide some directions for the future of this committee and the CSLA. And most recently, we've drafted an action plan, which is going to be presented to the CSLA board next week. And so the CSLA, this is a formal structure of the CSLA, and as I say, we're hoping to gain more membership. We're undertaking research. We have people who are practitioners, and we want to increase the membership so that it's seen as being a place where we can develop, as I say, respond to this mandate and provide some direction to members and to the association of the society. So my key message today, and I had a whole bunch of them, I've decided, is that I want to say that I think the primary purpose and objective of research in Indigenous matters in Canada is reconciliation. So is reconciliation between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country. Now that may seem, after Marcy's introduction, it may seem out of the discussions you've had fairly obvious, but I think it's really important to think of that concept, and that's what I'm going to explore with you. So the question is, what do we mean by reconciliation? And for the way forward, I say that I suggest you look at, and I look at, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's report and findings and calls to action. I don't know if you've had a chance to read them. It's a massive report. The executive summary alone is about 800 pages, to give you an idea of the scope. But it is very, very informative, and also is very helpful to provide guidance on many of these matters. So what is the TRC? You may have heard about the TRC, so a brief reminder. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 2007 as part of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, which was the largest class action settlement in Canadian history. So this was one of the outcomes. The Commission, the Commission carried out its work over about 8 years with a massive number of sessions. Research was undertaken. There was across the country discussion with survivors of residential schools, administrators, institutions, members of government, etc. So why is the TRC a key resource here? It's certainly not the first, and it's not the most recent major initiative that's looked at relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. For example, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, which was established in 1991 and for over 5 years carried on a similar massive cross-country series of hearings and research and produced an equally massive report, sort of didn't capture the imagination of government or the Canadian public in the same way that the TRC's calls to action have. The other interesting thing is that RCAP, because we're going to be acronym heavy, also recommended the establishment of a TRC type commission. So they envisioned that, and it took place many years later. We also have the Manitoba Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, and we also have the National Inquiry into the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. These commissions are, they're sometimes criticized as being, failing to act. But what I think what's happened to me, why the TRC is significant, is it seems to, as I say, capture the imagination. It has some momentum. It's not necessarily saying anything new. It's saying things in a very eloquent way. It's helpful, but it's also calling upon not just government and not just the institutions, churches, and schools, but it's also calling on the private sector. It's calling on all Canadian citizens to participate in processes of reconciliation. And as professionals, as academics, as researchers, as scholars, we have an obligation to respond. So the TRC released its final report in 2015. It included 94 calls to action, which were directed to all levels of government, all sectors of Canadian society, and all citizens of Canada. There's awareness then of the Commission's findings. We hear it all the time. It's in the newspaper, it's in public media, it's in common language. And it's my understanding that most, perhaps all, of the universities represented here today have formally responded to the calls to action and are taking measures and initiatives on reconciliation. So that was one of the things we learned from the environmental scan that we did as part of the task force, is to get an understanding of where various schools, and not just schools of landscape architecture, but allied professions are at. And that information is available to you from the CSLA. So there's momentum, but we need to do what we can to support and sustain the momentum. And so that comes from all sectors. It comes from practice, it comes from work through institutions, and it comes through the research that this organization is talking about. So as I say, I strongly recommend you have a shot at reading at least the executive summary of the Truth and Reconciliation. If you love history like I do, there's some excellent history as well in some of the other volumes. There's a separate volume on reconciliation. You can dive deep, and then it may take you elsewhere. It may take you back to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which is an equally compelling and thoughtful and dense document. So what is reconciliation? Now, Marcy had one of the definitions, or perhaps the definition, from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. It's interesting is there's sometimes debate and discussion about what the term means. There's some people who will say reconciliation is the wrong concept because it infers that there was, in fact, conciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And what's helpful is the TRC discusses this in the report, and they talk about that particular issue, and they also then come back with their own definition of what reconciliation is about. And so this is my own sort of little bit twist on the definition or the recommendation from the TRC. And I think I'm going to take a few minutes just to talk about it, because these words have some importance to the process that we're talking about today. So reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in this country. So first and foremost, reconciliation is a process as opposed to a product or an outcome. The TRC is quite helpful in this, and that the various people, and it's not just the TRC, there's voices from the various hearings that they have included. They had research undertaken for them, that's included. So there's a lot of discussion about and helpful advice in those documentation. But that it tells us that it's going to be a long process. And then in fact, you can almost get cliche, but the process is the important thing, because it's about establishing and maintaining relationships. And in my work with Indigenous people, the sort of thing I have learned with respect to things like what is Indigenous knowledge, what is environmental stewardship, the kind of things that we do on the job, is it's all about relationships between people and the land, between culture and land. So it's an ongoing process. It's mutually respectful as well. And this as someone who spent a lot of time dealing with the implementation and failure to implement treaties, and therefore negotiations and claims related to that, is I look at the treaty process about what it could have been, or what it represents, or what in fact it represented to, in particular, the Indigenous people. Whether the government officials believed what they were saying at the time, we don't know, but quite clearly, shortly after the signing of the treaties, one party forgot most of the obligations or the intent that those processes entailed. And I think, to me, when I look at Treaty 1, which is the treaty that affects this part of the world with respect to the First Nations people, and I look at the Manitoba Act, which the Métis call the Métis Treaty, what was promised at the time and what the intent was and what the vision was, it was very much about mutually respectful relationships. It was about moving forward together by recognizing and appreciate different worldviews and different cultures, different religions, different languages. And unfortunately, shortly thereafter, about 130 years ago, somebody lost their way, and it wasn't the Indigenous people. And finally, then I also talk about, I add a little S here to to peoples. And there's always a big debate, is that grammatically correct? But to me, it's one of the things we have to remember is that there is a tendency sometimes to, I think in the minds, I see it anyway, and I actually fall into this trap occasionally, thinking about indigenous people as an entity. But on all of the work we've done, you begin to understand it's individuals, it's individual communities, it's nations, it's different languages, it's different cultures, it's Inuit and Métis and First Nations people. And then I also talk about this country, because I think the important thing is, at least for the foreseeable future, is the research has to focus on Canada and Canada relations and relations between Canada's Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Certainly there may be things, and I'm sure there are things we can learn from other countries and other Indigenous cultures, but if we do that work, I think we have to bring it back, and it has to be done in relation to this paradigm. There, I used that word. Okay, so reconciliation. A couple of things. So I've got some quotes up here that I'll be using from the report, and I think I find them quite meaningful. But for example, reconciliation is something we learn to practice in our everyday lives. And in this context, in our work, in our research, and in our design and planning. And a reconciliation framework is one in which Canada's political and legal systems, education and religious institutions, the corporate sector, and civic society function in ways that are consistent with the principles set out in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So that comes straight out early on in the TRC calls, is that they invoke UNDRIP, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, another document that you should read that's incredibly dense. But again, it's really helpful with respect to providing a framework for engagement, for building relationships, for moving forward. So what does this all mean for the Land Terre Design Research Network? Well, I've got 3 questions I'm going to talk about today. And whether these are questions we talk about later, that's up to you, but these are the questions that I sort of put to myself and to you to frame the discussion. How can landscape architecture research add to and support processes of reconciliation? How should researchers approach and conduct their work in ways that contribute to reconciliation? And how should researchers engage with Indigenous people and communities in conducting research? And I believe Sherry has some specific examples to help us to further address this topic. So some of the things I've learned with respect to this first question, how can landscape architecture research add to and support process of reconciliation? So the process of research in itself should be conducted in a way that supports and sustains and stimulates reconciliation, healing and truth-telling, sharing and collaboration, empowerment of Indigenous people, and relationship building. There is a history. Other professions, including anthropologists, have had to confront and have addressed for all their time, and they have protocols and standards of practice related to research with Indigenous people. Because traditionally it was the case if you would come in, get information, and then take it away, and the people essentially were left with nothing and had given away something very valuable. So we need to assist Indigenous people to tell their stories, share values and worldviews. And this is one of the most interesting projects I've been involved in the last 2 decades, I think, was the work we did with the York Factory First Nation with helping them to prepare their own environmental assessment document for the Kiosk hydro generating project. Because they were very much struggling with whether they should be supporting this project that they are investors in, because of all of the potential adverse effects and what it represents with respect to their history and their culture and the land, relationships with land, their identity, and so on. So our challenge, what we tried to do, and I think we're somewhat successful at, was to help them to tell the assessment, to tell their stories from their point of view and with their words. The research needs to increase awareness and understanding by all Canadians about Indigenous peoples, cultures, values, languages, history, and landscape. So really a fundamental thing of our research would be to educate people, educate practitioners in landscape architecture, other allied professions, but Canadian citizens generally. And one of the things we can do as landscape architects or planners or both is to look at that, what we do, which is people and land, through the lens of Indigenous people and through the both lenses, one with each eye from the Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and talk about sort of a future that involves mutually respectful relationships with land. And as I say, the focus needs to be on Indigenous people of Canada. I can't emphasize that enough. That's essentially what the TRC is telling us. First and foremost, that's where we need to build relationships. The second question. No, that's my quote. I think that what this quote tells me is that the issue of, in our work, we apply and learn about Indigenous knowledge systems, oral histories, laws and protocols and connections to the land in the application to land use planning, environmental assessment, etc. So as practitioners, we have to undertake research to do our work. We have to develop a knowledge base, and then we have to carry on a collaborative process of learning with our clients in order to help them solve problems related to land management, land planning, economic development, environmental assessment, etc. How should researchers approach and conduct their work? Well, as I say, the first thing is, I think if you're going to undertake research in this topic, you need to educate yourself. You need to do some learning and understand Indigenous histories and cultures, colonization, treaties before you engage. It's fine to go in keen and enthusiastic, but I think you have a duty to have a better understanding so that you can ask informed questions, or when you get information, you understand its import. You need to ask, how will this research benefit Indigenous people? I mean, that I think is fundamentally important at this point. In order to build mutually respectful relationships, there has to be benefit, both in the process and with the outcome to Indigenous people. It's important to examine and be aware of your own values, prejudices, and ways of seeing the world. What I tell people is one of the things that I've really grown to appreciate from the work I've done over the years is it's working with Cree and Anishinaabe people and Inuit and Dene, is you begin to understand as you get to know them and they get to know you, and over time, they'll begin to speak frankly with you. You realize how misinformed you are, or how prejudiced, or how you see the world with a particular set of values, or your eyes only see the land in a particular way. And so as a result of that, it's often been a humbling experience. You begin to understand and appreciate more that there are different ways of seeing the world. And I think those of you who perhaps have come to Manitoba to study from different cultures, you already know that. And it is people such as myself, Canadian settlers of Anglo-Saxon stock, who have a little bit more harder effort to understand that the way in which our forefathers wrote the history of this country is a particularly narrow view. And that approach, as I say, needs to be mutually respectful. And the TRC tells us that the path to reconciliation involves awareness of the past, acknowledgement of the harm that's been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior. So there is a tendency to sort of say, well, what do I need to atone for, apologize for? It wasn't my fault. But in fact, the more you learn about the history, you understand that the system that we live in, our country, our systems and our institutions, continue to have create problems, those problems that have affected Indigenous people, such as the residential schools, but the failure to implement treaties, issues of water, housing, pollution, resource conflict. Again, it's essentially the same stuff, the same system that we need to address. We have much to learn, and we also have to learn to listen well. Really listen. Again, something I've had to learn. I'm still not particularly good at not talking when somebody asks me a question. One particular community I worked with gave me a nickname. I'm not sure whether it was tongue-in-cheek, I think it was. And they were good-natured fellows, but they called me Kakwajim, which they said in their dialect meant he answers. Because they would fool around and they'd ask me questions, like quite random questions, to stimulate an answer, and then they'd all break up or chuckle quietly. So I was being teased a great deal. But since then I've learned, I hope to say less. And I think the last experience I had of this nature was I was up in York Factory with the community, and we were speaking with the Clean Environment Commission, and they were doing a hearing as a result of their cumulative effects assessment of hydro development in northern Manitoba. And I was really patient, and I waited for hours, and I waited for everybody to speak. And I had some really good ideas down on paper, and I was letting everybody speak. And I thought that the way was clear. And I looked at Chief Ted Bland, and I said, Ted, can I go now? And he said, okay. And I said my stuff, and I thought it was great. I wrapped everything up. But then when Ted got up, he said that I had pretty well stolen everything that he planned to say, and he'd have a little discussion with me later. So my thrill of having thought this through and have some really good ideas meant that I sort of cut the knees out from under Ted, and I probably, definitely in hindsight, would have said nothing. So one of the things that's important in research and in design and in planning is to understand, my view is, with working with Indigenous people, is that it's not about you. It's not about us. Now that's hard because landscape architecture and architecture in particular, of the design professions within this program, I think, it's all about celebrating the designer and the design and the built project. It's all about the grand intervention and making an impact on the land and showing some physical form with your interpretation of an issue. So this is my interpretation of how to address reconciliation. Well, bully for you, but I don't think that is a helpful approach, and in fact, humility is a much stronger goal in this whole enterprise, because you can learn so much more from the relationship and from the interaction by just keeping your ideas in the can, as I found out through my own experiences. And how should researchers engage with Indigenous people and communities in conducting the research? So I think it's important to recognize that each community is unique. And that's true. You know, the language, the dialect between Nelson House, just northwest of Thompson, and Cross Lake, just north or southeast of Thompson, is different, is completely different. Their cultures and history are different. They're different communities with different aspirations and different needs. They're both Northern Cree, but each community is different. But also the personalities are different. They have their own organizational structure, their own governance, value systems, etc. So people say, well, what should I do? What's the proper way to approach this? And the advice is to ask the community. Ask for permission, ask for guidance, ask on how to proceed. There's a fear of sort of saying, what do I do? What if I say it wrong? What if I use the wrong term? And the point is, ask. If you go in on a mutually respectful approach in a respectful way, then people are going to be very generous and willing to support you. Particularly if you're going in understanding that you're trying to understand how to make the research beneficial to the client or to the topic. Indigenous knowledge was mentioned, and one of the things I've learned about Indigenous knowledge over the years is that it's a process as much as it is a product. In fact, it's more of a process. That the process of sharing knowledge and doing it on the land between generations, or in fact between an Indigenous person and a non-Indigenous person, is the process of sharing that experience and transferring the knowledge along the way. Because a lot of the knowledge relates to not things, but ways of seeing and values and language and relationships within that language structure. It's relationships versus data. And that there's one of the things that's really groovy and was done and became really a common thing was mapping of traditional territories and traditional land use areas. And we've done a lot of that as well. But it has a strategic importance usually within the context of land claims or resource management or land use planning related to, it's a strategy or a process in response to an outside intervention. Otherwise, the mapping process is not particularly important, and some elders are concerned about the fact that it interferes with the personal engagement on the land with the knowledge transfer. So there's some interesting discussion and debate and some interesting research opportunities related to that. Another thing is who is speaking and who represents the community, and is representation even the issue? Because again, as you get to know a community, there'll be various, as in any group, this group here, there's different people who have opinions, and other people have different opinions and values and knowledge. And so you have to understand, essentially, the community well in order to understand what you're being told and who's telling you. There's the issue of intellectual property and ownership, and that's interesting because it's come up more recently. Indigenous people, since I've started working, are more and more aware that there's this, that they own this information and it has value. And in fact, how it's used by us as practitioners or how it's used by us as scholars is significant. And sometimes it's disrespectful, the way that it's been used in the past or how we even do it today. And the other thing is that these are long-term relationships, invest time. There's communities that our firm has worked with for 40 years, and communities that I've worked with for almost 40 years. And you still learn something every time you engage the community as a result, because as the trust is built and knowledge, there's a greater willingness to share, or perhaps you see things better. And so it's not a short-term play. You need to devote, essentially, if you're going down this path, you need to devote the rest of your academic life to it, I think, to do it well. So how am I doing for time? Sure. Okay, I got a few slides then I'm going to go through and hope because I think there was a lot of text up here, so I got some images that you might enjoy. So a few thoughts about research topics.
Can I just stop?
Yeah.
I know some of you would like the lights dimmed to see the images better. We can't dim the lights because we're videotaping it and they need the lights for it, so I apologize. So I apologize to the images.
So the text works better. This is an image of the late Roy Redhead looking up the Hayes River just near York Factory. So one thing, history plays an important role in reconciliation. To build on the future, Canadians must look to and learn from the past. Well, I'm a history wonk, so one of the reasons I really enjoy my work is that it blends history and geography and analysis and planning and design. But a couple of things to think about is, this is a plan or a scheme of the Red River Settlement in 1870, and as they're called, Louis Riel's claims. But where we are right now was in 1870, when the province of Manitoba was formed. I don't know how many people know this. The population was approximately 12,000 people. 82% of those people in the 1870 census were identified as Métis. 5% were First Nations or Indigenous, and 13% were other. So Manitoba was a Métis province. And this was just before this wave of Upper Canada settlers started coming in that I was at the tail end of. This is a picture from Arviat, which is part of the Inuit relocations that occurred in around the 1950s. At about the same time as the Sisideni were moved to Churchill and the York Factory First Nation was moved inland from York Factory. There are many stories that have not been told about these relocations, which occurred as a result of government policy or government strategic values or administrative convenience, which are now only just becoming known many years later and are a serious issue that has yet to be seriously dealt with. And then there are land claims. There are 440 specific land claims in process today in Canada. Now, a specific claim is a claim for failure of the government to fulfill a treaty obligation. And so in addition to that, there's about 119 active comprehensive claims, which are claims outside of treaty. Now, notwithstanding the fact that there's been hundreds that have been settled over the last 20 years, that's a significant deficit. So it's important for us to understand about this outstanding obligation, which to me represents the same kind of failure of the non-Indigenous institutions of government to properly live up to the mutually respectful relationship that was envisioned in the treaties. So it's important for all Canadians to understand that without treaties, Canada would have no legitimacy as a nation. Now, this is, again, as I say, I do a lot of work related to treaties, so this is a particular bugaboo of mine. But as the TRC says, too many Canadians do not know the history of Aboriginal peoples' contributions to Canada, or understand that by virtue of the historical and modern treaties negotiated by government, we are all treaty people. And one of the things that's interesting, you sit there and say, I have treaty rights, you have treaty rights as well. It's not like, oh, these are the Indian treaties, these are the treaties that provide rights and benefits to Indigenous people. They provided rights and benefits to both parties. And the treaty process, it's useful to learn about that, to understand what was envisioned at the time and what did we get out of it, those of us who are non-Indigenous. So I have a bundle of treaty rights that I cherish. treaties between Indigenous nations and the Crown established the legal and constitutional foundations of this country. Pretty well the entire country is subject to one treaty or another, either an older treaty, a numbered treaty of Western Canada, or a modern day treaty. And if it isn't, quite likely it's subject to a land claim, such as all of British Columbia and significant parts of Eastern Canada. One of the things that is the Indigenous Issues Task Force has talked about is this, and Marcy mentioned as well, is that if you look at the Canadian Landscape Charter, which sets out what some of the principles are for the profession with respect to our work in this country, it aligns quite well with various Indigenous values and the values of Indigenous people. And so the human-land interface, the landscape, is a really important area of study and something where I think landscape architects can contribute. And what's interesting to me as a research topic is look at these traditional connections to the land, both from the Indigenous perspective and non-Indigenous, because these are just folks who have relationships to the land going back generations. They have values and principles related to harvest, and also from the point of view that there is a tendency to forget that this too is Indigenous land. There's often in the media and public speaking we talk about the east side of Lake Winnipeg as not being an appropriate place to build a transmission line because it's Indigenous land. And the reality is it's all Indigenous land, and there are values and people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, across the entire landscape. And that requires some more understanding, I think, to achieve this mutually respectful relationship. And without reconciliation with the natural world, reconciliation remains incomplete. So Elder Reg Croshu is quoted in the TRC report. He said, told the Commission that Indigenous peoples' worldviews, oral history, traditions, and practices have much to teach us about how to establish respectful relationships among people and with the land and all living things. And again, I believe from the work we've done over the years, and particularly with York Factory, that there's much truth in that there's a great deal to question about our own assumptions and approach to land management, land use, and land ownership. Learning how to live together in a good way happens through sharing stories and practicing reconciliation in our everyday lives. So, thank you.